Okay, so you all can see the slideshow, right?
Yes.
Okay, so we are going to be using what's referred to as okay. So this is a little bit complicated because of the way I teach it. We're going to be using what's referred to as either a dead palette or a Spanish palette. Both of those phrases are used to describe the palette we're going to be using as a way of starting to work with color in terms of something that can approximate a full spectrum. So when I say full spectrum, I just mean a full range of colors. You'll soon find out that these colors, as you can probably tell, will not give us a full range of colors. But I think there's an advantage to starting color by working with this kind of limited palette. And I'll talk about why in a few minutes. So we as everyone knows, and as I've repeated many times, we started the semester by making a painting using just white and black as a way of dealing with value. And then we moved on to using white, black with an earth red. And our earth red is a transparent red oxide, which can both give you a very dark red in its unmodulated form, but when you add a little bit of white to it, you get a color something like this. We're going to be adding to those three colors a yellow, so we're going to be adding yellow ochre, and we're going to be adding ultramarine blue. So two, like all the colors we've been using so far, two colors that have been around for centuries. And many paintings are done with just these colors. Many paintings where you will be surprised that the artist is able to suggest a fullness of color experience. Although maybe that's a little bit of an overstatement. Now, hopefully this doesn't complicate my presentation and what I'm trying to explain to you, but I just want to be precise about something. I want to be careful to give you the full information. So I mentioned that this palette, so these 5 colors, are sometimes referred to as dead palette or Spanish palette. That's not quite accurate. I actually call this lesson, and I think I say this on the syllabus, I call this the modified dead palette or modified Spanish palette. Because in fact, this is actually the true dead palette or Spanish palette. It's actually a palette where the artist is just using white, black, transparent red oxide, and then yellow ochre. And if you're wondering how with these colors an artist would get something like green or violet, black can act, or black often functions as a kind of blue, a very dark, a very gray blue. And you'll find that if you add yellow ochre to black, you get a kind of green. You get a very muted green, but it's nevertheless a kind of green. Or if you add transparent red oxide or another earth red to black, you get a kind of gray violet. And so you can get a kind of full range of colors, but it's certainly not a vibrant, certainly not a full spectrum range of colors. But artists have often used this, again, what's called the Spanish palette or the dead palette. I used to teach with, I used to go from black and white to black, white with transparent red oxide, and then into this palette before introducing a pure blue. But I found it to just be too frustrating, and I didn't find it to have that much value. So, so I like to go into, again, what I call the modified dead palette or modified Spanish palette. So, okay. So this is
Sir, did I miss attendance?
Who is this?
Samantha Tolan.
Okay, I'll get you.
Okay, I'm so sorry. Thank you.
That's okay. So, so this is the palette we'll be using today. So just as a reminder, I just want, again, I know I've said this many times before, but I just like to really emphasize that I think of this class as a progression where each lesson leads to the next. I just want to remind people the progression we've gone through just using my demo paintings. So we started with what we call a grisaille painting or black and white painting so that we could start to clearly see value relationships as the first step in understanding how to make a convincing representational painting. And then we talked about how objects in the world, meaning all objects in the world, could be usefully understood as being made up of planes and thinking about objects as planar, or in a sense reducing them or interpreting them as planar structures helps us clearly describe the movement of volumes in space. And again, just to remind people, it's because when we're working with relatively simple objects that are constructed of planes, and when a light source is hitting flat, broad planes, we can easily communicate the direction those planes are moving through space. So with either a very simple geometric form like a cube or a more complex form like a dodecahedron, we talked about the way those objects would respond to a light source, the kind of light source we've been using in this class. And we interpreted a piece of fruit according to its planar structure. And then we moved on to, we assimilated all that information into the last still life we did, but introduced transparent red oxide as a way of looking for temperature in the objects we're painting. So the distinction between warm and cool. So obviously warm, cool, warm, relatively cool, and so on. So we're going to build on that by now moving into a fuller range of colors, or a fuller palette. So something like the dead palette or the Spanish palettes, but we'll be using the modified Spanish palette. Where did my other palette go? Modified dead palette or Spanish palette. So now the reason the term dead palette is used, and I think I may have mentioned this, but I'm not sure. At least I think this is why it's used. This is what I'm assuming, is because the materials that are used to mix, it's sometimes also referred to as the dead layer. Actually, now that I think about it, maybe I'm wrong. I've always assumed this. I've always assumed it's called the dead palette because the pigments come from dead organic material, right? So these pigments are easily accessible in most places on the planet because these come from clay, which is a kind of, which is the end result of dead organic material. So yellow ochre comes from clay, transparent red oxide comes from clay, ivory black comes from animal bone. Although it may be that artists often will use this as a first layer, and that's sometimes referred to the dead layer. In other words, it's a layer of paint where the artist has not started working with vibrant color yet. So actually that may be the source instead of it being dead organic material. I'll try to find out for sure. Okay, it's relatively clear-cut why it's sometimes called the Spanish palette. So this is a very famous painting that's at the Metropolitan Museum of New York, Metropolitan Museum of Arts, right here in New York. It's a painting that's always hanging, so anyone can go see it. It's by an artist named Diego Velázquez. His last name is spelled Velazquez. Diego Velázquez, very famous Spanish painter. And artists in Spain at this time very commonly used that very limited palette. So the full range of flesh tones would have been achieved with just that earth red, the earth yellow, and various mixtures of black and white. The greens in this painting, these kind of olive greens or army greens, would have been achieved with black and yellow ochre. So, okay, so this is another of his paintings. I don't know if anyone knows this painting. Anyone know this painting? No one's familiar with this painting? So this is a painting, when people take Art History 102, you'll see this painting for sure. This is a painting called Las Meninas, which means the ladies in waiting in Spanish. It's a very famous painting for many reasons. Artists or painters tend to adore this painting. It's considered a kind of tour de force of a painter's skills. But you can also see in this painting, a painting that suggests a full experience of color. When you actually analyze the color, it's very limited. So we have blacks and, kind of warm grays tending towards green. We have the flesh tones achieved with those limited colors. You can see the limited colors on the artist's palette: white, transparent red oxide, or let me change that, white, earth red, yellow ochre, black. And so all of these colors are within that relatively limited range of colors that can be mixed with those colors we're using today. This painting, by the way, I obviously have no idea how people are responding it to on first seeing it. The skill I referred to, I said it's considered a kind of tour de force of painters or a painting skill. It has to do with how the artist is able to create a incredibly convincing sense of the presence of actual human beings, an incredibly convincing sense of space and light, with a kind of economy of means. In other words, they're able to very quickly and very, as if effortlessly, create that illusion in the way they put the paint down. So a lot of artists, a lot of painters particularly love that. This painting also has a kind of mystery to it that's often commented upon, and a complexity in the way the artist has shown what's ultimately an official royal portrait. So can anyone see where do we, it's a royal portrait of the King and the Queen of Spain, King Philip IV. Anyone see the King and Queen in this painting?
I think I do, but I could be like really, really wrong.
Okay.
Are they in like the frame that's to like the side of the painter, or are they the two like adults standing behind the girl, like kind of stretching out her dress?
So your first response is right. So this is the King and Queen reflected in a mirror. And this, of course, as you can probably tell, is the painter, Diego Velázquez, painting the King and Queen. And we assume making a painting here that's a large-scale official portrait of the King and Queen. The King and Queen are reflected in a mirror, so we assume they are behind us as the viewer. They're somehow outside of the picture plane. And that gesture, the fact that the artist is acknowledging, in a sense, what the artist is doing is acknowledging the artificiality of painting, because he's acknowledging that the painting he's making here represents somebody who's outside of the canvas. And that acknowledgement of the artifice of this representing something out there is really the first time that kind of thing had ever been done. So it's prompted a great deal of speculation about why the artist did that, which is, as far as I'm concerned, pretty fascinating. But anyway, back to our purposes today. this is a Spanish palette, the kind of painting that's done with the limited colors we have. So how many people have worked with this? Or can anyone tell me what this is and how it is useful to an artist? Anyone familiar with this?
A color wheel?
Color wheel, right. So maybe that's a very easy question to answer. And what does, was that Kayla, was that you?
That was Roanne, but honestly,
Roanne,
I'm not too sure how it's used.
Okay, anybody else? Can anyone else tell us how it's used or why is it beneficial to a painter?
It tells us the relationships between colors, like what is complementary, what's analogous, what's warm and what's cool.
Okay, great. And who was that? I'm sorry, I'm not seeing who's speaking.
This was Kayla.
Kayla. Okay, so great. So that's good information. So you mentioned complementary colors, analogous colors. Let's back up one step, just in case anyone is not familiar with this. What are these three colors here referred to? So in this color wheel, this is a primary red, primary blue, primary yellow, and they're pointing to those colors located on the color wheel. What do we call these colors? So Rowan and Kayla don't answer. Anyone know? I mean, I assume most people know because we're taught this in grade school.
Primary colors?
Primary colors. Who is that?
Samantha.
Samantha. Okay, so primary colors, and what do we know we can do with primary colors? And again, I know this may be a lot of review, but I think it's worth just going over this. What do we know we can do in theory with the three primary colors?
Mix them to make any other color?
Yes, in theory, we can take these three colors and mix them in various percentages with each other to make any other color. So we're going to find out that even when we're using these three colors here, that's not really true. It's true in theory, and it's true if we're talking about primary colors in the light spectrum, but it's not true when we're talking about physical colors that we actually mix on our palette. Nevertheless, it's good information to have because we can certainly start approaching that with the primary colors. So the primary colors, when we mix two of them, we get what are called secondary colors. So we mix yellow and red, we get orange, blue and yellow, we get green, blue and red, we get violet. When we mix violet and red, we get red violet, and so on. So I think it was Kayla who mentioned complementary colors. Can anybody other than Kayla say what complementary colors are supposed to be useful for? Like, what do complementary colors help us think about or help us do as painters?
Isn't it to like bring balance to the image?
To bring balance, you mean to create a kind of like compositional balance? Is that what you mean? Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like
They weigh each other out.
They can do that. But that's true. But something I'm thinking more about what happens when you mix complementary colors. Does anyone know what the idea is when mixing complementary colors? What happens? So just so it's clear, complementary colors, you'll find complementary colors on opposite sides of the color wheel. So here we have blue. Its complement or its color opposite. Those are the same things, complementary colors and color opposites. Here's blue. Directly across from it on the color wheel is orange. So orange is the opposite of blue, or the complement of blue. Red is the complement of green. Yellow is the complement of violet. Red-violet is the complement of yellow-green, and so on. So the color wheel is arranged so that the complementary colors are directly across from each other. So if we were to mix orange with blue, equal amounts, in theory, what should happen to those colors? Kayla, do you know?
They'll neutralize each other and make brown or gray.
They'll neutralize each other, that's right. They'll neutralize each other and in theory make a middle gray or a neutral gray. In other words, they'll desaturate each other and you'll end up, and sometimes color wheels have this, you'll end up with a neutral gray, an absolutely middle gray. Now, Kayla mentioned sometimes you get brown, and that's often what happens in reality. Again, understanding color and color theory, understanding the color wheel is extremely useful. But there can be a difference between what should happen in theory and what usually happens when you actually mix the physical substance of paint on a palette. And that's because what happens in theory is based on what happens when colored light mixes. Whereas there's a slight difference, or there's some difference when we're actually mixing physical pigments with each other. But what happens is you neutralize, so you gray down the color. So that's very useful for us because there are going to be many times in making paintings where you want a certain kind of blue, let's say. And you have this pigment on your palette, but that's not exactly the right blue. You need a blue that is grayer than that. So there are many different ways of making that gray blue, but often a good option is mixing its opposite with the blue to gray it down. It's also a very useful way to think about mixing color shadows. So for example, if we were using a full range of colors to paint the orange we painted in the last class, you could mix orange with blue to get a very rich, very convincing shadow color for the orange. So try to retain as much of that information as possible. We'll go over that more. And we'll talk about that today with our limited palettes. I'm going to talk about that as we work on this painting. Okay, so now limited palettes, I may have asked this question before, but just thinking about these paintings we've looked at so far, what's a reason an artist may choose to use a limited palette? Like, what could be the advantage of a limited palette? Again, I think I may have asked this before, but like let's just say an artist had a full range of colors available, but instead of using those colors, they deliberately chose a limited palette, which actually does happen quite a lot. Anyone know what would be an advantage to that?
The painting would be really uniform, like it won't look all over the place, like color-wise.
Exactly. So the painting would be very unified, right? You would have a sense of a kind of unified whole. And artists frequently make that choice to use a limited palette for that reason. They want to create a painting that's compositionally unified so that all parts of the painting relate to one another. You know, and you can think of that in the way music might repeat musical themes in order to keep a piece of music or a song being musically coherent. You know, and most people, under most circumstances, consider that type of thing to be pleasing. right? When there's a coherence to a work of art. Now, that's not always the case, but that's often the case. So in that way, I think it's useful to introduce students to a limited palette so that you see its possibilities and you can use that when you think it may be advantageous to you. Now, the part of the reason artists at one time would have used a limited palette is also that they may only have had those colors available to them, or those may have been the only colors that were affordable to them. That certainly happens, but there are other reasons to use it that are not just based on the fact that that's all you can get. So the other reason I think it's very useful to teach color starting with a limited palette, and by the way, I did used to teach this class where we would just do the black and white painting or the grisaille, and then immediately go into a full range of color. But I found that to be, I often found students would be very confused to with what to make of all of these colors sitting out on the palette. And I think it's much more effective to go through colors slowly, starting with limited palette and then moving on to a full spectrum palette as a way of really understanding how color can be used. So in addition to the black and white we're going to be using today, we'll be using these three colors, which we can think of as our primaries. They're going to function for us as primaries. So it's probably obvious the way earth red will function as our primary red, the way ultramarine blue will function as our primary blue, and the traditional primary blue is based on ultramarine. So there's no disjuncture there. Yellow ochre, this earth yellow, is obviously not like our primary yellow. So that's going to result in us only having limited mixing means with this yellow, not to mention this red. But we'll see how we can use that limited palette to our advantage. So we do want to start thinking of these colors as primaries. So we can mix these colors, we can mix ultramarine blue and yellow ochre to get something like a green, transparent red oxide and yellow ochre to get a kind of orange, and so on. And then we'll talk about using those color opposites with each other. So, and then finally, I just want to mention that sort of picking up on the idea of a limited palette being used in order to create a kind of unity, there are many different limited palettes that people use. So one relatively common limited palette is black, white, and then primary yellow, primary red, and primary blue. And I'll talk about some other limited palettes. This is a famous limited palette, or it's become famous recently because there's been a renewed interest in this artist's work. This palette is sometimes called the Zorn palette. It's based on a painter named Anders Zorn, Z-O-R-N. And his palette was vermilion, which is a bright kind of primary red, yellow ochre, and black. And then this is someone has mixed using these three colors as primaries, the black as a blue, the vermilion as the red, and the yellow ochre as the yellow. You can see the way the artist can mix black with yellow and get something that starts to suggest a green, this kind of very dull army green or olive green. The artist can mix vermilion with black and get something that starts to approach a purple or a violet. Vermilion and yellow ochre, and they start to get an orange. So variations on the limited palette have been used, and if you continue to work with painting and become more and more involved with it, you'll find other variations of the limited palette. And you can see in this artist's work under Zorn that he's clearly using a limited palette. Again, to get back at the discussion we had a few minutes ago, he's using it to achieve a kind of unity in his work. as we discussed. So that's again the Zorn palette. And I just do want to point out that anytime you hear that an artist uses a limited palette, you'll find that when they need to, they expand beyond it. So this is a Zorn painting, obviously of a landscape, and clearly Anders Zorn did not mix these greens just with black and yellow, right? He needed a more spectrum green to mix these colors, or at least a more spectrum blue. So limited palettes are very useful, very good way to learn color as a kind of slow introduction, but by no means, and people probably understand this without me having to say it, but by no means are they the only option available. So I'm going to close out of that, and we will go right to our demo today. So I just want to make sure no one's trying to get in. Okay. Okay, so, and please let me know, I know there's some, I don't have the best equipment. I think I've apologized for that before. If you can't hear me as I'm talking, please don't hesitate to let me know. So I have the camera set up here so that you can see both the still life we're using and my palette. And I'll switch to the painting in a few minutes. But I just want to talk about some things related to color, the way we're going to be talking about this limited palette. So the limited palette I have set up today is, again, white, ivory black, transparent red oxide, which I've mixed a little white into, so you can clearly see it's red. The yellow ochre, and then ultramarine blue, again, with a little bit of white mixed into it. So if we take our versions of primaries, we can start to construct for ourselves a little color wheel. So let's do that. I'm going to put red at the top, yellow ochre here, and then our ultramarine blue here. Okay. So now, as I mentioned, we can use these colors to create a kind of a version of secondaries. So we have our primaries, red, yellow, blue. We can start to mix secondaries, so we can mix a kind of green. Now that's far from a vibrant green. But I think, again, I think the advantage of using this limited palette as an introduction is that there are many times you're going to need a green that is not vibrant. And there are times where you may need exactly that green. And it's much easier to mix that green using this limited palette primary set than trying to take a very vibrant green and neutralizing it. So we can get our green, we can get our kind of orange, and we can get a kind of violet. Now our violet's perhaps the trickiest of the colors to get with that limited set of colors. And violet's actually a surprisingly tricky color to get if we're trying to get a very vibrant version of it. But again, that's a kind of violet that can be a very useful, it's a very gray violet, but that kind of gray violet can at times be very useful and very beautiful, depending on how it's used. Okay, so we have our limited palette, Spanish palette or dead palette. We have our primaries made from that. We have our secondaries. Now let's look what happens if we talk about that property of the color wheel we mentioned a few minutes ago, which is that color opposites can neutralize each other. So if I want to mix a blue that is a little bit less vibrant than the color wheel blue, notice what happens when I put some orange into it. It grays it down a little bit, it neutralizes it. And here it makes a darker blue, and put a little white into that. A darker blue that's starting to approach gray. So that's the theory behind that. And I would have to do a little bit more work, mixing colors, mixing into this to get it really something that looks like a gray. But you can see how we can neutralize or gray out or tone down a blue by mixing its color opposite into it. So as we're using these colors, you want to start thinking about, or try starting to think about, how you can use those colors to achieve that full range by thinking about them as 1 primaries, 2 secondaries, tertiaries, and then complementary colors. And again, specifically using complementary colors as a way to gray down, or for our purposes, to make the colors of shadows in the paintings we're making. So I'll, by the way, post an image of the color wheel on Blackboard so everybody has it and can refer to that. So let me clean up our little color wheel here. I'll save some of this blue. Save some of this yellow. So I'd like to mention one other thing about something I'm doing today that's a little bit different. My studio has north-facing light. So the windows in my studio are facing north, which means that at no time during the day does direct sunlight come into my studio. It's all indirect sunlight. So I have, and that's the kind of light that traditionally was the light that artists preferred, because you could have constant light all day long, with light that didn't change. And artists often love this light because it gives a very particular kind of sort of blue-gray, kind of pearly color to things that it's illuminating. So let me just, by way of making, I'll just talk a little bit about the color of light, which is something that I'd like people to start thinking about. So as you're looking at the still life, just note the color of those objects under that daylight. Again, that daylight, that indirect daylight, is a kind of cool bluish gray. I think of it as a kind of pearly light. Notice what happens when I turn on the incandescent bulb. What happens to the color when I turn on the incandescent bulb that we've been using throughout. We get a much warmer, color for that. And that's actually less warm than I thought it would be. But so basically the color changes depending on the light you have. So I happen to love this kind of light. And I wanted to show people what it looks like. If anyone has available a north light room that you can work in, you could certainly use north light the way I'm doing. If that's too difficult, I mean, or if you need to work at night, using the clip-on lights is fine. It also, people can probably see, it gives a kind of softer light. And some people like that kind of softness of the light. So as we're going to be working on this still life today, let's just talk a little bit about how we might mix some of those colors. So if I'm going to mix that blue of the background, I don't need to ask people what I would do. I think it's probably obvious that I'm going to try to match that background color, or as close as I can. So I'm going to take my white, and then I'm obviously going to add blue to it. So as you're looking at that So as I've mixed that blue on my palette, and we compare it to the blue up in the still life, now unfortunately, because of the limitations of this camera, you're not seeing as much of a difference as I am. What difference are people seeing between the blue I've mixed up and the blue of the background? Do people see any difference?
The one on the board is has like a little bit of green, but I don't think we're really tracking that. So
which one has a little bit of green?
The green in the blue in the background.
The blue in the background of the actual setup?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah, that's true. It does have more green in it than mine does. So maybe you can see the colors a little bit more accurately. This blue up here, yeah, this is, unfortunately, it's not really showing up on the camera. That makes a little bit of a difference. What about now? What difference do people see now? It makes a tiny bit of difference. Like, what's the difference between this blue and that blue up there?
The blue on the palette looks more purple.
It looks a little more purple, right, which would go back to, I don't know who the first person who spoke was, but that's in a way the same thing as saying that's a little bit more green. You're getting at the same thing. The blue in I will just tell you as I'm looking at this still life in person, the blue up here is grayer than this blue. This is a more vibrant blue. And that's not too far off from what you all are saying. You're just getting at it in a different way. If I want to gray this down in order to get that closer to the blue up there, if we think back to what we talked about a few minutes ago, what could I do to this blue to make it closer to the blue in the background?
Add orange.
Add orange. That's one option. That's right. So I'm going to do that. I'm going to take a little bit of orange. Now remember, I'm going to be adding orange because orange is the opposite of blue. And color opposites or complementary colors gray each other down. So I'm going to take a little bit of orange. So I'm going to mix some orange. I'm going to pull this back now so you can see the full palette. So I'm going to take some red, mix it with yellow ochre to make it kind of orange. And I'll move a little bit closer now to see if we can get, again. Now, I mixed that by eye and by hand. So it may not be a perfect orange for what I need to do, but let's try it. So I'm going to mix that orange into this blue. I'm not going to put a lot in, just a little bit. See what happens. So I want to gray down that blue. And I've grayed it down, but I've grayed it down, I would say, a touch too much. So I'm going to put more blue into it to bring back a little bit of its color intensity. Or another way of saying that is bring it back closer to full saturation. In other words, a sense of the fullness of that blue color. Put some more white in because that blue in the background is whiter, is lighter. A little bit wider. And what does, now that we've made that step, what needs to change? Whoops, I made this too much white. Little bit. Okay, so certainly we can see how we've grayed it down. What maybe could change to make, what's off now? Right? We've grayed it down, but I think we've grayed it down too much. What do I need to do to make this closer to the blue up there? So if I really want to get that exact blue up on the still life, what do I need to change about the blue on my palette? What do you think I should do? I'd like people to look and answer because I want people to start the process of this thinking that is involved in mixing colors. So Anna C., what do you think I should do? What should I do to blue to change it so that it's closer to the blue in the still life in the background?
The still life blue looks like the blue pops out more. I feel like the one on the palette is a little dulled down.
Yeah, exactly.
Would you add blue?
The one on the, you say the one in the still life is a little, pops out more.
Yeah.
The one on the palette is dulled down. That's right. And another way of saying that, the way, like using painters' language, is that the blue in the still life is more chromatic. So chromatic just means closer to full saturation of color. So that a very chromatic color pops out. And the color on the palette is dulled down, so it's grayer than it should be. So I need to make the color, I need to make this more vibrant to get that color. So I'm just going to put more pure blue. It's pure blue mixed with a little bit of white. And so I've obviously just grayed it down a little bit too much. I don't know if I should say obviously, but I've grayed it down too much. So I'm going to put a little bit more pure blue into it, and then a little bit more white. And I'm going to do this thing, this trick. I don't know if it's a trick, but I often do this. I'm going to hold my my palette knife up to the blue that I'm trying to match. And I think we're pretty good. I think we're pretty close. So does anyone not understand the way we modified the blue by using its opposite in order to get something closer to the blue we were looking at? Does everyone understand that? Or if anyone doesn't understand that, just let me know. So I'm going to save this blue. I'll use this for the background. Now, before we move on, as we know, I think as I think I've told you before, the local color of that piece of paper in the background is, we would all call that blue. I think there would be little disagreement. Maybe some of us might say a lighter blue, but it's blue. That's the local color. But of course, the reason we can see that local color is because it's strongly illuminated. There's a lot of light on it, or there's enough light for us to be able to read the local color. Other colors up there, other colors of that same blue object are less easy to perceive. So for example, the color of the shadow that's being cast on the wall, that's not the same blue, right? So we need to mix a different blue for that. What about that color? How would we get that color? Like if we do the same thing we did for the light area of that blue background, if we just take our primary blue, is that the right color for that background? I mean, for the shadow?
No.
No, and so when looking at and struggling to mix colors, what you always want to ask yourself is, like, what do I need to do? Well, first of all, let me step back. You want to start color mixing by finding the color that's as close to what you're trying to achieve as possible. So with our limited palette, that's as close as we have to the shadow color. But that's not the shadow color. We need to alter that. We need to modify that. What can we do to modify this so it's closer to that shadow color there? What can we do to it?
Would you add red?
Add red. Okay, well, let's try that. Why do you say red?
Well, that red specifically gives you more of a darker violet color instead of like a very bright violet, so.
So do you mean add the pure red?
I would do that. I mean, you can also do black, but I don't know, I guess my first guess was red.
Well, actually, you bring up, I think, something that will be useful for us to talk about, which is adding black. Because I think a lot of people, when they're first mixing shadow colors, they tend to think about taking a color, like let's just say our blue, and just adding black to it. But that's often not the best choice. And let's see why. So let's see what happens. So I'm going to take our blue, and then I'll mix black with it. Now, as I've said before, I don't think that an artist should never use black. Like sometimes in painting classes, or particularly beginning painting classes, or when you hear artists talk about how to make colors, they say you should never use black. I think that's nonsense. I think black is very useful. You just have to use it the right way. So we've made, black has certainly darkened that blue, right? It's made it darker. It's also made it grayer. Now that's probably a little bit too dark for the color we want. So let's put a little bit of white into it. So how does that seem for the blue, for the dark blue in the background? Does that seem like it would work?
I feel like it looks too blue still.
It looks too blue still, that's right. So black, because black is a cold color, right? If you remember back to the still life we did where we used white, black, and transparent red oxide, we were working with warm and cool. And so putting black in it has made it too cool. So what we haven't done, and that's a really good observation, is we haven't quite seen the fact that this blue is both darker than this blue, but it's also slightly warm. So why is this blue warm? Like why is there a warmth to that blue color there? Remember what we talked about in terms of the way light works. Like light illuminates something we're looking at, and the light tends to do what?
Is it because it's reflecting?
Exactly, right? The light's reflecting. So the light's not hitting this area directly, right? That's in shadow. But light is bouncing off this wall of the box, and it's inheriting or picking up some of that warm brownish color and then bouncing back into these shadows. So it's creating a slightly warmish blue in these shadows. So we can mix black with that blue, but we're going to have to warm that up. So it might actually be easier to actually, again, just mix blue with an orange to both gray it down and make that dark kind of blue color. So now maybe that's a little bit too green, possibly. So I'm gonna add a little bit of red. This is too green, and the opposite of green is red. So I'm gonna add a little bit of red. Just warm that up a little bit. Now, I don't remember who said that we could add black, but that's not entirely wrong either. The only issue is that when you add black, that color stays too cold, so you have to warm that color up too. But it's probably just easier to just put orange into blue to make a neutral, a warm, dark blue. So I'll take all of this, mix a little bit of orange into it. to get that grayed down dark blue that we talked about, or that neutralized blue. Something like that. We're going to have to change this a little bit as we're doing our painting, but this is a good color for us for now. Let's see that. We're doing on time. It's 2:47. We started at 1:40. All right, so if you give me just a minute, I want to now go into the demo of painting this drapery. And so the painting for next week should be a drapery study, similar to what I'm doing. And I asked people at the beginning of the semester to buy that little, it's basically a napkin. You can use any kind of drapery. Again, as I said at the beginning of the semester, if you didn't buy that through that online link, you can easily get a monocolored or a single colored napkin at like any dollar store or Target or anything like that. So you want to find a small, manageable piece of drapery, something like what I'm using. And you want to hang it in a very simple, clear way, like I've done. I put it in my box. I cut one wall out of the box to let the daylight in. So have that for the next still life assignment. Okay, so give me a minute. I just need to adjust my setup here. And we'll get started. So I'm just going to move my paint up a little bit. So as I'm cleaning off all this mixed paint I used a few minutes ago, you can do this if you want to save paint. So if I take that mixed paint I used, kind of dirty mixed paint, and mix that all together, you never know quite what color you're going to get, but you might end up with something that's very useful. So I've mixed all, taken all that color. I'll probably use this in the blue. So I'm going to save that. By the way, that I just used one of these paint scrapers to get most of that paint off. This is a very handy thing to have if anybody wants to add to their tools. It's a paint scraper with a razor blade that can be changed out. It's a very easy way to clean a palette. So as always, I sent people a reference photo. As I'm working on this drapery, I won't have, you won't be able to see the still life I'm working from. So have that reference photo, if possible, to refer to. Okay, so, all right, let me, and before I start my painting, let me just point out one thing. So people notice that I have this cone with me here today. So the reason I have this is the cone that we started the semester with. And we can think of the forms on the drapery, each of those individual forms that are receiving light and shadow. You can think of those as variations of a cone-like form, right? So this form here, that long piece of drapery, this form here, each of those forms are basically modifications of a cone. So it can be easy to get wrapped up in details like little wrinkles in the form or whatever detail we may be looking at. But it's very useful to remember that most forms in nature, as they say, can be thought about as more or less complicated versions of basic underlying geometry. And it's a very useful way, a very helpful way to think about how we can most successfully paint objects you're looking at. Okay, so let me just, I'll go back to our, all right. Okay, so I think we're ready to go. Okay, so I'm again going to draw this relatively quickly. I'm not going to go over drawing issues again this time. Well, actually, let me just say a couple things about drawing this object. So I'm going to use, we have yellow ochre now in our palette. I'm going to use yellow ochre as a drawing color. And yellow ochre is a very useful drawing color because it doesn't interfere with, or it interferes much less with other colors we're going to put down on the painting. So I don't know if people remember with the last painting, I used black to draw the still life, and that was not a very good decision because the black was very hard to eliminate from the painting as I blocked in all of the objects. So I do want to just say, as I'm drawing out this still life, you want to make sure you're not getting bogged down in little curves and changes in, let's say, the contour or any little wrinkles that you may observe. We're again just blocking out using the most simple method possible. We're blocking out the major features of this drapery. So I'm not looking at any details. So if people look at the reference photo I sent, you'll see that we can think of the part of the drapery on the right-hand side, the right-hand column of that drapery. We can think of that as just a simple, a modified, simple, long triangle form. So I'm going to draw it that way. And then next to that drapery, or next to that form, is just essentially another long triangle form. Got a little fold at the top first. So then we have this other long triangular-like form, which has a slight shift in the contour before we come down to the bottom of the drapery. So again, the reason we want to just really radically simplify is we don't want to be distracted from seeing the large, important relationships on an object we're painting because we've spent too much time looking at the small information. The small information should always be added later. So I'm just looking at the large movements of this drapery as I'm coming down the contours, looking at large proportional relationships. I'm trying to get this angle, the angle of the fold separating the two pieces of cloth exactly right. That's an important part of, that's going to be an important part of making this drapery seem to be hanging in a convincing way. So I've modified or changed the angle of the line that needed to change. And that means I'll change a little bit. I'll change other contours. When you make one change, you find that you almost always have to make several others. And the reason I like to assign a drapery is it seems to me to be a good sort of next step in the progress we're making towards complexity. So we thought about simple geometric forms and how they respond to light as a way of starting the process of being able to paint them. And it seems like a very useful transition to go from those simple geometric forms to drapery, which can come off or can appear to be very complex at first glance, but if really analyzed, is really just a series of modified geometric forms in various relationships to one another. So just blocking in those very simple angles and proportions of this object. I'm certainly not looking at the hem at the bottom of that napkin. I can put any of that detail in. I'm just trying to plot out convincingly major shapes, angles, and a clear sense of that form moving through space. Now there's a little fold at the bottom that I'll include. Okay. So I have the main contours of that very simple drapery. Now remember, when we're painting objects and trying to make as convincing a representation as possible of those objects, so in other words, as convincing a sense of the three-dimensionality of that object, we want to look very carefully at how light and shadow is falling on the form. So what's happening with the light and shadow? The light, again, is coming from this direction. We've got a three-dimensional arrow to indicate that. So any planes on the object that are facing that light source are going to be illuminated. And any planes on that object that turn around in space, that start to turn away from that light source, are going to drop into shadow. So there's not going to be enough light for us to see the local color of that form. So we're going to get a diminished, perception of that color. So it's going to go into shadow. But then that shadow, as we've talked about, is going to pick up a whole range of reflected lights, creating an entirely new color. So the first thing I'm doing is drawing out those shadow shapes, just as we did on the simple geometric forms. And then I'm going to block in masses of light and shadow.
Someone locked out.
I'm sorry?
There's someone locked out.
Okay. And then I'm going to be blocking in the painting in terms of those masses of light and shadow. So if you look carefully at, if you can take a look at the reference photo, and you look at the right-hand cone-like form of the drapery, you'll notice there's kind of irregular shape of shadow along the right-hand side of that cone-like form. And that's a part of the form where we no longer see the clarity of local color green. Instead, we see that dark, kind of dull green. And then if you notice on the right-hand side of that drapery, we have another irregular shadow shape, as about half of that form drops into shadow. So I'm tracing out that shadow shape before I'm going to block it in. That's unlike our geometric forms. It's a somewhat irregular shape. We're going to have to work with how to make those, how to see and make those irregular shapes of light and shadow. And so then we have our cast shadow. The right-hand side of the form. And from my point of view, I can see the corner of the box. So I guess I'm going to put that in. I could choose to leave that out, but I think I'm gonna put that in. And then the corner of the box drops back in perspective like this. And then the cast shadow from the drapery runs along the floor of the box. And you get a situation something like that. Okay, I think here what I will do, it's a little bit early, but I think this is the best time to take our mid-class break. So let's take our break now, and we'll get started again. Today we'll take a 20-minute mid-class break, so we'll get started again at 3:28. Okay?
Professor?
Yes.
Sorry, I had some internet issues. I couldn't get in before.
Okay, I got you on the attendance.
Sure, thank you.
Sure.
Professor,
Yes.
I just have a quick question. The
Sure.
drapery, can it be any color? Or
It
does it have
can
to
be any color. Yeah, it can be any color. Do you have a drapery?
I have one, but I'm not sure. I don't think it's the right one. So I think I'm gonna buy another one.
Yeah, it can be any color. Just don't, just remember we have a very limited color palette right now. So if you buy a color that you can't mix with, you can't match with these colors we have, just get as close as possible. Does that
Okay,
make
yeah.
sense?
Yeah, it does. Because I have a white one, but like the texture is kind of rough. I don't think it's really gonna work.
What is the texture? Is it like terry cloth, like a bath towel?
Yeah, kind of like that type.
Yeah, that's not the best thing to use. If it's possible to get something different, I would.
Like a smoother one.
Yeah, it's more clear. Light and shadow is going to be more clear.
Okay, thank
Okay,
you.
if possible, sure.
Okay.
Is my audio working? Oh, it's working. Did you get me earlier on attendance?
Yeah, I got you.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so I think we should be back. I started to block in as much of the background as I could. So I'll continue. Let me just continue with that. But I actually realize I can show more or less everything I'm working on. So just I want to point out a couple things. I think this is the most useful way of doing this. But obviously, this corner of the painting is not bent, right? That's the distortion of the lens. And I just will point out that, again, because of distortion, the still life drapery looks much thinner than it actually is. So that's distorted, but at least you still have some sense of what I'm working from. So let's just talk about mixing up this color with those limited colors we have. And I'll just say, I'm not going to paint both the color of the paper and the color of the box. I'm just going to paint the color of the paper that the drapery is sitting on the bottom of the box. So using our limited colors we have here, I'm going to start by mixing white with yellow, right? Because that's a kind of pale, dull yellow. On the monitor, it looks like a tan, and it is a kind of tan color. I'll start with white and yellow. And what do people think I should add to that to get me closer to this kind of tan peach color of the paper? What should I add to this?
Maybe a little red.
Yeah, a little bit of red. I think that's right, to get it closer to a kind of peach. And then as I'm looking at the painting, as I'm looking at the still life and then the paint I've mixed on my palette, that's a decent color, but it's a little bit too intense. It's a little bit more chromatic or intense in color than the color I have up in my still life. So I'm going to neutralize this. Since this is a kind of orange, right? I've mixed yellow and red plus white. It's kind of orange. So I'm going to take my blue, which is the opposite of orange, and I'm going to neutralize that. So I'm just going to dull that down. And that gets us closer to where I want to be. It should be a little bit duller still, a little bit more blue in it. And then that's about the color I want for that, for the floor of the still life. So I'm going to take that color, lock it in very broadly, perhaps a little bit too dark. Now that I have it on my painting, because it should be just about the same value as the blue on the wall, maybe a little bit lighter. So as we've been doing all semester, I'm just blocking up to the still life. I mean, up to the object I'm painting. And so that could still be, my colors are still a little bit too chromatic. It's a little bit too yellow. So I'm going to, again, put some blue into it to neutralize it. Here it's possible we could just be using black. I've already started with blue, so I'm going to keep that. And I'll just block that in. That's probably a closer color. I'm not going to worry so much about that color over there. I can always change that later. And so for our purposes right now, I'll extend that color all the way over to the edge of the box or the wall of the box. And so the shadow of that box, so that's actually a kind of, as I'm looking at it, now you may not be able to see this given the kind of color that this lens will be able to show you. But that's it's a kind of violet. It's kind of warm violet. So I'm going to mix that shadow color. And I want to point out, I say that's a warm violet. So I don't want to just, it's a very dull color. It's, very gray, that shadow color of the paper. But I don't want to just say it's gray or it's brown. I don't want to go for some immediately apparent way of identifying it. I want to look for the color complexity. If I really look at that color, I see that yes, it's gray, it's grayish. Yes, in some ways we could think of it as brown, but I think it's actually a more complex color than that. So it's a kind of warm, I see it as a kind of warm violet. It has a kind of grayness. It's a kind of, overall, it's a kind of gray violet that then has little bits of warmth in there. And so I always want to look for, the color complexity. I want my colors to be rich and really start to reflect the complexity of colors we see in the world. And just to remind people, I'm very carefully painting separate areas of lights and dark masses. I want to avoid putting down one big light color over the entirety of the object and then trying to paint the shadows into that. It doesn't work because again, for two reasons, because oil paint stays too wet, and the wet paint that you've already put down is going to continuously change any color you try to put over it. And then also, that is a way of avoiding really working with lights and shadows. You want to really concentrate on seeing how the object is revealed to us as a pattern of lights and shadows. So that's a really important aspect, always an incredibly important aspect of these paintings. So now the warmth of my shadow is a little bit overstated. It's not quite that warm. I could go in and modify that. I think I'm going to leave it for two reasons. One, I don't want to dwell on this area, but just for the sake of the demonstration. But also, I don't mind letting shadows be a little bit warmer or heightening the warmth of shadows. I find that to increase the believability of the shadows. Shadows tend to have warmth, a kind of undertone of warmth to them. And so I like to emphasize that sometimes. So I've blocked out, again, the very simple, a simplified block in of the light and dark mass there. And as always, I'm now going to go in and find a halftone. And as I've said before, halftone is often cooler. And I think just look, if you look at the object I'm working from, you can see that halftone that transitions the light into the shadow. So I'm going to take some of my shadow, mix it with my light, and then that's a relatively cool halftone. I'm going to cool that down with some blue. Again, here, given our limited palette, it's possible you could cool that down with black. I think blue is probably a better color to do it with. So I'm going to go in and term I've used before is stitch in that halftone, or feather in the halftone. Now, I want to emphasize again, you always want to be looking for these halftones. So you're not looking at light and shadow, but then letting an oversimplified block in of that light and shadow create the sense of a kind of cutout form. You always want to indicate those transitions between the halftone transitions between light and dark that maintain the clarity of the light and dark masses, but allow for a softness in the transition from one to the other. Okay, so now we'll move on to the drapery. And if you notice, and you can see it on the still life, you'll notice that our forms, on the right-hand form, we have the shadow pattern on the right-hand side. On the central form, we have a shadow pattern, and then we have a very dark cast shadow. So in my first block in, once I mix up the colors of the drapery, I'm going to block in all those shadow areas as continuous areas. So I'm not going to separate out those areas of form shadow and cast shadow. So at first, I'm not going to paint as separate areas, the form shadow and the cast shadow. I'm certainly not going to paint as a separate area, the reflected light in there. So I'm going to just be blocking in those masses as continuous shapes of shadow. So the first thing I'm going to do to mix that dark green is I'm going to take my ultramarine blue and then mix it with some of my yellow ochre to make it dark, a very dark green. Now that color, it's a little bit too blue because it's a relatively warm green. So I'm going to put a little bit more yellow ochre. And then in order to make that as dark as I think it needs to be, I'm going to put just a touch of transparent red oxide. So again, if you look at the color wheel that I will send you, if you're able to pull one up now, red is the opposite of green. So I've mixed up a green for the shadows on that drapery. And if I need to make them a little bit darker, I can use green for that purpose. Now that doesn't mean, again, I want to emphasize, that doesn't mean I always have to use red to make the shadow colors for the green object, but it's often a very useful way of doing it. So that color I put down, I was starting to block in that shadow mass. So the color I put down is a little bit too dark. There's a little bit more yellow in it. So I'm going to add yellow. Still a hair too dark. My studio is getting very dark. It's a cloudy day. I think on your screens you all can still see well enough. You know, it looks the image looks a little bit dull, but you can see. Okay, so I'm blocking in this shadow mass, and unlike the shadow masses on the simple forms we've painted, although like the shadow mass on the orange we painted or the other pieces of fruit, this is an irregular shadow shape. So I'm trying to paint it so that I have a clear sense of the direction of the plane that shadow shape represents. So it's showing me a plane moving through space. And I'm also at the same time trying to get the irregular characteristics of that shadow shape. Okay, so this central form on the drapery, that central form is kind of long cone-like form. That has a shadow shape along the right-hand side of it. And that shadow shape merges with that shadow shape, or I should say, I am merging that shadow shape with the cast shadow. So let me show you what I mean by that. So I'm blocking in one large area of shadow mass that includes the form shadow, so that central volume of the drapery, And it also includes the cast shadow. So here, I am painting this all as one unified area. Then I'm going to go in and I'm going to add the cast shadow wet into wet. So I just a few minutes ago said that you don't want to put down a big mass of light color and then try to add the shadow or create the shadow by painting the shadow color into that. And that's certainly true. You never want to paint a shadow color into a big mass of light color that you've already put down. Again, because the light color is inevitably going to bleach out your shadow color, and you won't be able to achieve a rich, convincing shadow color. But when I'm painting a cast shadow, so when I'm painting this cast shadow, that dark line of cast shadow into the shadow mass, that can relatively easily be done. That's often a good way of painting a cast shadow, is to paint it right in to the shadow mass. So I'm going to carve out my shadow mass, block in the entirety of that shadow shape. Long shadow shape that includes the form shadow and the cast shadow. Or with the clouds out there, my studio has gotten incredibly dark. But to me, it looks like the image is showing up perfectly well on the computer monitor, so I can keep going. So now I'm using the same green. And I'll block in the irregular shadow mass on the right-hand form of the drapery. Again, that right-hand cone-like form. And so the irregularity of that shadow shape, in other words, it's not just a very simple, it's not simply a long triangle shape. It has variations because of the irregularity of the fabric. So I'm approximating that as I block in the painting, but I don't have to sweat about getting it exactly right. I can obviously always go in and adjust it as much as I feel like I need to. So I'm again just blocking in big masses. I just want to see big relationships of, first of all, shapes and angles in the drawing of the drapery, and then big relationships of value, color and value, as I'm blocking in the drapery in relationship to in this case, in relationship to other objects around it. In this case, those objects are simply the paper on the back wall of the box, on the floor of the box, and the box itself. Now, I'm going to add a couple accents before I go much further. What I'm going to add a dark shadow accent or occlusion shadow to clarify the drawing of the contour that marks out the distinction between the drapery and the back wall of the box. I'm just going to go in here, dark or occlusion shadow, and I'll clarify some of my drawing as I'm doing it. I'll try to clarify some of my drawing. Bit of occlusion shadow down here as the back wall of the drapery slides behind, or the back wall of the box slides behind the drapery. So here, painting wet into wet, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, is entirely possible and advantageous. So when you're painting a dark accent into a shadow, that's a good place to paint wet into wet. But again, you can't paint wet into wet when you're trying to paint the shadows into a wet light mass. That doesn't work. But I am going to paint wet into wet to create, I just created the occlusion shadow of the occlusion shadow that's created on the blue of the back wall. And I'm now going to paint in the cast shadow, the very dark cast shadow behind the central form of the drapery. So that central form of the drapery is creating that central form of the drapery is blocking light from hitting a small section of the right-hand side of the form on the right. Go into the very dark green. And I've made this very dark green by mixing black with yellow ochre. And I'm going to clarify the drawing here this very dark cast shadow. I'm going to let that very dark accent color merge with the main shadow color I already blocked in. So now I have to mix up the color for the light side of that drapery. And it should be for us now, after our discussion this morning, fairly straightforward. So that light side of the drapery, that needs to be slightly lighter than the blue paper behind it. And it's a relatively dull green. So I'm using, so the colors we have will get us pretty close. I don't think we're going to be able to quite get that green. I think we're going to find that that green appears to us a little bit more grass-like, or a little bit more fresh grass-like in color, or even, like we might say, sort of leprechaun green, than the color we're going to be able to mix up. It's obviously not leprechaun green, but it's more like that than the color we're going to be able to mix. So we're just going to be able to mix a color that will get us as close as possible. So I've mixed yellow ochre with blue. And I think it needs to be a little bit more blue, and then maybe a touch of white. And I'm going to test that by putting it down here next to the blue and just asking myself how appropriate that value is. That needs to be lighter. I think it's clear. Because the light side of the green needs to be lighter than the blue. Still too dark, as we can see. The color's okay. I think it's not, the color we have up there in front of us is a little bit richer, but I think this color is going to be reasonable given the limitations of our palette. I think this color will get us pretty close to where we want to go. So I'm just blocking in, as you can see, after having blocked in the dark masses, I'm just blocking in the very simple light mass right up to it. As I'm blocking the light up to the shadow, I can just merge them a little bit to start the process of creating that halftone that I want. So again, I'm looking through any small details. I'm not dwelling on halftones for now. I'm just painting in the very big planes of light and shadow. So this halftone, the halftone that describes that column of drapery turning around in space towards the back wall, that I'm not going to paint yet. That halftone I will paint, again, wet into wet. So again, there are times when wet into wet is a good way to paint. But right at this stage, I'm going to be more simple in my blocking. I'm not going to paint all of those little variations of halftones and so on, highlights, that kind of thing. I'm just blocking in the very big masses of lights and shadows. Now that I have most of the light mass on the left-hand side of the drapery, I see that probably my shadows here need to get darker, which I can easily do. Does anybody have any questions about what I just mentioned about not painting certain halftones? Like, I'm not going to, again, I'm trying to stay as simple as possible. I'm trying to get the big sense of what I'm looking at, but not trying to paint too much right away. So does anyone have any questions about that? I know sometimes people can be confused by what I'm leaving out. I'm just curious if anyone has any questions. Okay. So I'm going to, now I see that my shadow needs to get a little bit darker. I'm going to darken that shadow. What actually is going to happen here, I didn't intend this, but it works out. What I'm going to do is darken the shadow and create, in effect, a core of the shadow and a reflected light. So by darkening the shadow, I'm in effect here creating the core of the shadow. And the lighter shadow color that was already there, which admittedly was a mistake, but I'm going to leave that as the core of the shadow. So I hope and I think at this point, everybody remembers what the core of the shadow is. So again, I'm darkening that shadow because I saw that it needed it. And my mistaken too light original shadow color is now going to serve as the core of the shadow. Does anybody have any questions about that? So I'm going to use some of my dark here to go in and draw some of the details. Or I shouldn't say details, let's just say I'm going to clarify. The drawing of the drapery as it meets the floor. Drawing that little shadow shape, fold of the drapery. Continue blocking in here. So let me just, I've done several demos already this semester, and people have sat through them. So I will let people know that if you feel like you have enough information from the demo up until now to do your painting, people can sign off if you don't feel like it's necessary to watch the rest of this demo. Of course, what I'm going to be doing is I've done the block-in, right? We've talked about how to mix these colors. So we've taken the intense blue that we made from white and ultramarine and neutralized it with its complementary color orange. We created the greens in a similar way by mixing ultramarine blue and yellow ochre and then determining that that needed to be neutralized a little bit with its opposite. So a little bit of transparent red oxide. I've done the block-in the same way I've done all semester, starting with the background, the floor, and blocking in the light masses and the dark masses on the object itself. And I'm going to continue working on this, right? So I'm going to continue to develop all of those elements of light and shadow that help create a convincing sense of the volume. So I'm going to develop the core of the shadow, the reflected light, highlights, and I'm going to be adding them to the painting, always adjusting so that I am developing an accurate representation in my painting of the values that I'm seeing in the setup. So again, if anyone feels like they don't, that they can use the experience you've developed so far in the semester to go forward from this point and complete the painting, anybody is free to leave. I'll continue painting to the end of the day today, the end of class time, to continue developing this. I just wanted to let people know that. So, okay. All right, so I will then continue on. And I'll continue on as long as I can see. I mean, as I'm looking at again, as I'm looking at the monitor, it seems that you all can see, for some weird reason, you can see the colors better than I can. I'm having trouble seeing. I have worked in light like this before, so I'll go as long as I can.
Professor, I have a question.
Sure.
So for the setup, does the background have to be blue specifically?
No, it doesn't have to be blue. I just wanted, no, you can use anything you want. I just had some blue paper. I wanted to make I guess the reason I did is I thought it'd be useful to talk about mixing that particular blue, but no, you can use anything you want.
Okay, and also for like the bottom, I could like use a different color as well.
Yeah, of course. Yes, the color of the drapery, the color of the background is all up to you individually.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, so as I continue, I'm going to continue blocking in the light masses on the green drapery. And I'm paying attention to how the light how I can use the light to reestablish the shape of that cast shadow that I talked about. And then as I did before, I'm going to block the light mass of the drapery up to the shadow mass on the right-hand form in such a way that I'm in effect redrawing that shadow mass. So I possibly would spend a little bit more time trying to adjust the green so that I can get it closer to the green of the drapery. I'm just looking at the drapery and thinking about the colors I'm using, the palette we have. I think I might be able to get a little bit closer. I certainly don't feel the need to do it now in this demo. But certainly on a second layer on this painting, I may try to adjust these colors. Now, as I said, because of our limited palette, we may not be able to get that green exactly. That's a possibility. But I would want to do a little bit more work to determine if that's absolutely the case. So now that I have more of the colors blocked in, and I'm looking at my still life compared to the drapery in front of me, it's very clear that my still life is the green in my still life, at least as it is right now, is a kind of dull olive color. And I'm not quite getting, there's a richer, more chromatic blue-green on the drapery. Now, the question of whether or not I can get that, that's uncertain to me right now. But again, I would try a little bit harder to get that. So I will fiddle around a little bit. With the top of this drapery. To get the drawing of these folds up here, right? So shadow comes up, and the shadow kicks over to the left a little bit. Shape them down like that. I don't want to neglect the drawing of that fold up there because the drawing of that fold can be a very important thing in making a drapery appear to be convincingly hanging from the point at which it has been pinned. People will often neglect that, but I think that's an important part of what we're trying to paint. I'm going to pay attention to that. Get up there. Okay, so I have a rough in of my drapery. The drawing is certainly not perfect. I do want to remind people that because of the fisheye lens that I'm unfortunately doing this demo with, there's not a very clear correlation between the image of the still life that you're looking at and the drapery I'm blocking in. There's distortion that's throwing off the comparison. But I have now my main elements of lights and shadows blocked in. My big colors and the main elements of lights and shadows. I'm going to leave this. I won't use time on our demo to paint that side plane of the box. I do think one thing I'll do now, now that I have most of the painting blocked in, I think that the background paper needs to get a little bit darker as it meets the drapery itself. So I'm going to go in and darken that a bit. just so I can bring out a little bit more clearly the light on the drapery. I'll feather this darker tone into paint around it. So that helps me set off the lights of the drapery a little bit better. Okay, so before I really lose all of my light, I'm going to do a little bit of work on this form on the drapery in order to just to illustrate some of the steps you want to take as you're developing your painting. And then I'm going to probably have to end it a little bit earlier than I want because I'm having a lot of trouble seeing. I apologize for that. I guess I should not have should have known better than to attempt to use daylight without knowing for sure that it would be sunny all day. So just to point out, again, I'm going to develop, now that I have the simple blocking of light and shadow on this form, I'm going to start developing that form. I'm going to start making the form more convincing, rounder. I'm going to start making the color richer. And just remember that the way you want to do that is you want to look at the object and find those elements of light and shadow that we've been studying. So we have the simple light and dark mass. Now we want to find core of the shadow, reflected light, halftones, and highlights if that's relevant. And we want to look at the values and the colors of those different elements of light and shadow. So the first thing I'm going to add here is I'm going to add what we call the core of the shadow, right? So light is not reaching this part of the drapery, but light's bouncing off forms around it, back into that drapery, and it's creating a core of the shadow. It's creating reflected light here, but then the part of that shadow that doesn't get any reflected light and doesn't get any direct light either is called the core of the shadow. So I'm going to paint in that darker band on the drapery, and I hope you can see it. I think you can. I can see it very clearly. It's a very clearly discernible darker band of shadow. Painting that wet into wet. And as I'm painting it, I'm just looking at the way that band of shadow turns and changes direction as it moves up the form. trying to be accurate in my drawing of that so that I have a convincing representation of that core of the shadow. And now the shadow color I initially blocked in, I think works pretty well as the color for the reflected light in that shadow. So here, that initial block-in color I think works pretty well. It could maybe be a little bit warmer. It's working decently well. It's the color of the reflected light. So now I'm seeing, I've blocked in the core of the shadow, now I'm seeing halftone here. There's a band of halftone. It's not the lightest part of the drapery, it's just slightly darker. So I'm going to make that by putting a little bit extra blue into the green I mixed up for the light mass. And I'm going to block in, start blocking in that halftone, both merging it with the core of the shadow and using it to create that sense of a rolling form. And I'm gonna use that halftone to turn that shadow into the light in exactly, or as close as exactly, or as close as I can get to the exact rate of turn that I'm looking at in the object itself. In other words, how quickly does that form roll around from shadow into light? Is it a very abrupt change, like in the corner of a box, or is it a softer change, like on a column or on a cone? Of course, here it's a softer change. So I'm trying to suggest exactly that rate of turn. These little dimples, these little wrinkles that you can see in the setup, I'm not going to worry about those right now. If I were painting this, I'm not even sure I would put them in. I don't find them that attractive. Sometimes there are parts of draperies that are very beautiful. I don't particularly like those. So I'm not sure I would put them in. I mean, maybe I would if I really want to give this the look of a piece of used kind of utilitarian drapery. They're not that important to me now. It's not to say you shouldn't paint them if you want to, but okay, so I'm going to go in and correct a little bit my drawing. Yeah. So how are we doing on time? It is 4:30. And okay, folks, I'm going to have to leave it here. Actually, it's just because I know you, as I'm looking at this computer monitor, I guess it's the way the camera is picking up information. The colors are fairly clear, but I'm having a lot of trouble seeing. I'm not really able to see the colors I'm mixing on the palette. So I'm going to have to end the demo here. I will try to maybe continue this again tomorrow and then upload the completed demo. But I have to leave it here just because I can't really see my colors anymore. But I think that this is actually enough information to get started. Again, you want to now bring it to this point and then carry the drapery forward by completing all those elements of light and shadow. You want to find and paint in the reflected light, core of the shadow, halftones, highlights, and so on. Does anybody have any questions about any of that? Or anything I can clarify before I end for the day?
So should we use a cloth that's just like a solid color and not a pattern?
Yeah, don't use pattern because that's going to just, that's just a layer of complication that'll just, it's already hard enough to create a really convincing sense of form. Like, let's not throw pattern into that because it'll just make it that much more difficult. I mean, if you have a piece of fabric that has a very subtle pattern that still allows you to see the lights and shadows, you can use that, but I wouldn't paint the pattern. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Does anybody else have any questions? By the way, I'm almost positive that next week we do not have class. I think, I may be wrong, I'll confirm by email, but I think next week is a Monday schedule. But at any rate, I'll confirm. I think you have 2 weeks on this. Does anyone know off the top of their head? Let me just check something before we end. Let me double check that. Yeah, so next Wednesday is no class. It's a Monday schedule. So you have 2 weeks to do this assignment. Okay, so are there any other questions before I sign off?
Bye. Thank you, Professor.
Thank you very much. I'll see you all next week or in 2 weeks.
Have a good one. Professor, do you mind staying on for like 1 sec after everybody gets off?
Sure, sure.
Thank you. Hi. Okay, so this is actually super embarrassing, but I've been meaning to kind of reach out to you.
Uh-huh.
Our first meeting, I kind of told you like I'm still a beginner, and
Okay.
I hate telling any art professor that because I feel like they hear that and it scares them, but I just want to let you know I've really, really been putting in a lot of effort into my like works, and like I'm doing them like 3 times over because like I'm pretty bad, but I'm just like working super hard, and I submitted like the last assignment kind of late, but I am taking your critiques and like trying to apply them. So I just wanted to let you know, like,
Yeah, that's okay.
I'm really trying. It doesn't look like yours, but I think you see the effort. So
Yeah, and of course it's not going to look like mine. I mean, I've been doing this for years. So yeah, that's totally fine. Don't worry about that. I don't grade based on previous experience or, what we call talent. Not that you don't have talent, but if someone's struggling with this, I don't hold that against you. I grade on the effort that's evident in the work handed in.
cool, awesome. I really, really wish this could have been on campus. That's what I was like looking forward.
I know. This is getting old. It's because, I have to admit, it's a diminished experience for this kind of like hands-on painting. There's no way around it.
Yeah.
And that's not so much the case with other types of courses. But for this, it really is. So I apologize. I mean, hopefully we'll be done with this sooner than later.
Yeah, no, it's totally, totally not your fault. I just started taking like art classes at QC, and it helped me so much, like having someone with me and like being hands-on.
Yeah, of course.
Definitely like trying to adapt. So I just wanted to let you know, and I appreciate it. These demos are amazing. I literally just watch them over and over and over again.
Okay, good. I'm glad to hear that. Thank you.
Yeah. All right. Thank you so much. Have a great day.
Okay, I'll talk to you soon.
Bye.
Bye-bye.